Of all the introductions I've received, that's the most recent. It's not the first time in my life that I've had to follow Rabbi Stanley Davids. As probably you know, he's also spent a considerable amount of time on the pulpit of Temple Emmanuel in Atlanta, and it wasn't one or two times that he graciously asked me to speak from the Bima, including during several Yom Kippur afternoon services. I think he figured that I could keep the congregation awake. There are people here tonight who deserve recognition. Everyone in the Plevan family who've come from far and wide. This is certainly a significant moment in the whole process of remembering the life of an individual who loved the University of Arizona. I'd also like to thank longtime friends, the Baker family, who have been gracious in their friendship over the years, including those who aren't here, which means one of their children who I got to know pretty well, and one of their grandsons who happens to be my intern now at the Institute for the Study of Modern Israel. So all of you, thank you for coming tonight. I hope the time will be worthwhile. The topic is not an easy one to address. It probably deserves several lengthy monographs. When you prepare a talk that you've never given before, you try and find out who's written what where, and curiously enough, I can find out what's written about what goes on in Israel on campus. I can find out what some people have commented editorially in blogs. I can even find it sometimes in some erudite writings. What I couldn't find at all would be, what do you teach in the classroom? Can't find it online. Now, I've collected literally hundreds of syllabi from across North America on how Israel is taught. And it's been something I've been doing well before I started the Center for Israel Education in 2008. And there's a set of conclusions I'd like to draw tonight. And from those conclusions, I'd like to end with what might we do in the realm of teaching modern Israel on campuses. There is a wealth of courses that have been given on the topic of Israel. And most of those courses don't deal with Israel per se, except in terms of the conflict. I would venture to say that 75 to 85% of the courses that are offered in undergraduate institutions in North America today are offered where Israel is part of the title, have to do with the Israel-Arab conflict or the Palestinian-Israel conflict. Finding courses that just deal with modern Zionism, finding courses that deal with Israeli society and identity, finding courses that deal with religion and state. They may be found in other courses that are given in other departments. Naturally, of course, there is always a sense of content, Judaic content, when one is dealing with Jewish studies. And Jewish studies, as here at this institution, has a rich background to it. It could be richer if it had more professors, but I won't go into that right now. But Arizona is doing really well vis-a-vis other institutions. Israel studies, or the study of Israel on modern American campuses, is a rather new phenomenon. Jewish studies, as we all know, or the study of Judaism and Jewishness, comes out of the 18th and 19th centuries. Certainly comes before that when we take a look at how rabbis and other Jewish intellectuals studied their identity and studied their texts. That is a rich tradition that goes back hundreds of years. Jewish Studies Department in North America probably go back to the early part of the 1900s, maybe one or two of them go back to the 1800s. My position at Emory University in 1998, my position as a chair in Jewish Studies, that is a named chair that associated with Israel Studies, that was the first one in the United States. Now that was 1998. 1998. Jewish Studies was taught in a great way in this country in the 60s and 70s and 80s, but its major focus was Holocaust studies. Let there be light. Holocaust studies sucked the oxygen out of the focus of Judaic studies and out of the study of Israel studies. And it became a real problem on campus to teach a study of modern Israel because Jewish studies departments were not necessarily interested in touching on modern Israel because it was a modern topic. So you would have modern Jewish history, early medieval Jewish history, rabbinics, Bible, but Israel was not really incorporated as a main area of topic and a main focus when departments decided to hire new faculty. It just didn't happen. And this is all the short circuit by saying, if you want to know why Israel may be treated as it is on campus today, in part it has to do with course offerings that aren't there and didn't start to be there until about 15 or 20 years ago when visiting Israeli scholars came from abroad and filled slots, and occasionally universities would fill slots as well. So what I want to do tonight is go over the reasons why modern Israel as a learning area was not focused on in America, why it did not become a focus on the university campus, what has happened, and what can still be done. And with your permission, I'm going to try and use a PowerPoint and see where we go. The overarching concept for the state of Israel may be seen in this comparison of photographs. The photograph on your left is David Ben-Gurion, Chaim Weizmann, and Eliezer Kaplan. March of 1939, that is just before Hitler invades Poland. It's after the Nuremberg laws. Jews don't have a state. The photograph on the far right, from where you're sitting, September 78, that is the Israeli parliament. Bottom row, left, Simcha Ehrlich, Menachem Begin, Ezra Weizmann, and the balding man, you can't see his face, Yigal Yadin. The second row, if I can see on this angle appropriately, Shimon Peres, Yigal Alon, and Abba Eban. Now what is the difference? The difference is the entire raison d'etre for the state of Israel. That Jews should have self-determination and control their own destiny and not be the object in someone else's sentence, but be the subject of their own. The photograph on the right is Jews exercising choice, because they have the right to choose. The photograph on the left, there is no choice. They are the object of what the world wants to do to Jews at that particular moment in time. Why is Israel so fierce about defense of its right to self-determination and doesn't want someone else to tell it what to do? It's because it has struggled for choice. That's what Israel is, the Jewish right to self-determination. So that's the overarching concept of why you even study Israel in the first place. When you learn American history, how, when, and where did you learn it? And how many times did you learn it? From 5th grade, from 5 years old until 18. How many times? How many times did you learn about Washington, Lincoln, FDR, World War II, the Civil War, the Revolution? 7, 8 times over a period of maybe 16 years? How frequently before 18 did you learn American history? You know, some of you may be here, maybe from Canada, Australia, or Kathmandu. My apologies to you. Do you remember your mentors? Do you remember those teachers who made an impact upon you? You probably do, in the field of American history, or world history, or any other kind of science, or humanities, or social studies. Who taught you about being Jewish by comparison? Or who taught you about Judaism? Your role models? Your experiences? Maybe you grew up in the same community with a relative who survived the Shoah. They showed up at the Seder and they could show you, or they couldn't show you, but you would stare at the numbers on their arms. But did you go to school to learn it? If you went to school to learn it, you went voluntarily. It wasn't compulsory. You didn't have to learn Ben-Gurion and Weizmann. You didn't have to learn Kalischer. You didn't have to learn Chaim Nachman Bialik. If you learned it, it might have been at a Hebrew school. It might have been at a day school. It might have been at one of those wonderful occasional afternoon Jewish schools that were taught in supplemental schools in synagogues. And wonderful is said with a certain amount of cynicism. Because I went to one of those schools on Long Island in the 50s. And I can tell you Tuesday and Thursday and Sunday were not a lot of fun. Now, where did I learn it? I got my Judaism and my knowledge of Israel and my affection for the state from my parents. German Jewish immigrants, Orthodox German Jewish immigrants. History was important, holidays were relevant, smells were critical, foods were essential, and singing all 6 or 7 stanzas of Mo'os Tzur on Hanukkah was essential. My formative experience came when I was age 13. My parents took me to their hometowns in Germany. In one hometown, where my great-grandfather had endowed the land on which the synagogues had stood, and still stood in 58. Strange as it seems, because there had been Kristallnacht in 38. Now, the question you ask, why? It stood because the synagogue was too close to the other houses in the community that if they fired the synagogue, they probably would have burnt the entire village. We drive up along the side of the synagogue, the old synagogue, of course it hadn't been used in 50 or 60 or 70 or 80 years, whatever it was. On the side, there's a walkway that went to the top. I had a penknife. I opened the door. I cracked it open. Inside there was an Aron HaKodesh, an ark. The ark had been reconstructed by someone from the Third Army as it swept through Europe. I opened it, and in the bottom there were parchments of Haggadot, Sefer Torahs, you name it, even a Megillah. Hey, Dad, should I bring these down? Of course. I brought them buttoned down, under my arm. I'm 13 years old. I'm all of about, I don't know, 5'3" or 5'2". Maybe I weighed 115 or 120 pounds. A lady comes out to the car. By now the car has drawn a lot of attention from the locals in Angenrode. And the lady looks at me and she stares at me and she says, "Das gehört dir nicht." It doesn't belong to you. My father, who rarely spoke German after he left Germany in 1927, whirls around and rips this woman apart in German. And I knew he knew German, but I didn't know he knew it that good and that fast. That was my seminal moment of knowing about my Judaism, because I knew those were texts that said something about who I was. I guess that was the event that channeled me into history, into eventually Jewish history, Middle Eastern history, and Israeli history. How many people have those kinds of experiences? Or how many people grew up with those kind of role models? And who taught you about Israel? Who taught you that Israel was relevant? Who taught you that it was about self-determination? Not just about Jews wanting security, but Jews wanting to choose for themselves. Curious as you answer the question to yourself. Teaching and learning Jewish, teaching and learning about Israel was negligible. Our parents said to us, give your children your chance that they never had, because they had come perhaps first or second generation from Europe, or from any other place, Middle East, Central and South America, wherever they may have come from. Obtain your education, my father said. No one can take it from you. I don't know how many times he said it, and I always asked him, who do you mean they? And he said, don't worry, Ken, you'll know when they want to take it from you. That was his response. What happened on campus? When I was a graduate student at the University of Michigan, we learned history. I took British Empire history, I took British history, I took Islamic history, I took Jewish history. I didn't take a course in Jewish narrative. I didn't take a course in dual narratives. I didn't take a course in parallel narratives. I took a course in history. I was taught nuance. I was taught gray areas. I was taught to take several pieces of information and blend them into one. Not to teach them side by side because they needed to be justified to be taught individually. So what has happened now in the teaching of history, we now teach narratives. You may say it's American history, but you're really teaching the narrative of someone who was part of that American history, leaving something else out. I don't like the word narrative. I think it's a condescending term that's used to justify delegitimizing someone else so you can promote yourself instead of them. A student of the 60s, I remember Michigan in the 60s. How could you not if you protested the war in Vietnam? How can you not remember how people had sit-downs? History was to be admired. History was not something to be taken for granted. I would argue to you, I just recently became Professor Emeritus at Emory University. I would argue to you that the students I taught in the late 70s and the early 80s definitely had a concept of history. I would argue to you that the students I've taught over the last 10 years don't come to campus with the same knowledge of history as those students did 40 years ago. They're good with Google. They're good with blogs. They're good with finding information, but do they know context? No. And you don't have to be Jewish not to know context. It's not a Jewish disease. Context is not a relevant concept when it's taught in high schools today. I'm sorry to say, if I'm standing here in front of a high school teacher and if I offended you, I apologize. But by and large, I don't think context has a very high variable, a very high important quotient. in the study as we prepare kids to come to colleges. As I said earlier, Jewish Studies is 150 years old, Israel Studies 40 years old. The Association for Israel Studies only began in the mid-1980s. The Association for Jewish Studies began at least 2 or 3 decades earlier. We are really new. We are babies when it comes to the study of a particular country or particular concept. Chairs and programs in Jewish studies, I alluded to them already. Middle Eastern studies in the United States focused elsewhere. And I'll tell you why. You have a Middle Eastern Studies department or program here at the University of Arizona. It is a National Defense Foreign Language, it is a National Defense Education Act, Title VI center. It receives annual funding, as do maybe another 10 or 15 or 20 others in North America. I was part of the Middle Eastern Studies Center at the University of Michigan. I know very full well how it works and operates. The NDA Title VI program began in '59. And it began in '59 because the effort was to educate students in neglected languages. Korean, Japanese, Arabic, Etruscan, you name it. Spanish, French, Hebrew, German were not considered neglected languages. So what happened was Middle Eastern centers or Asia Studies centers or African Studies centers received a lot of funding from the federal government to train students in these languages so we could be competitive with the Russians worldwide. How many people took Hebrew at the University of Michigan when I started in '68? 80, 90, 100, 150 of them in a first-year class, and maybe 70 in a second-year class, and maybe 25 or 30 in a third-year class. I challenge anyone on Zoom or anyone here today that can tell me that there are 25 students who are taking a third or fourth-year Hebrew class at their institution. And I don't care if you're 25 or 30,000 students in your undergraduate program. If you don't study Hebrew, you can't know Israel. And how many American Jews know Hebrew? How many American Christians know Hebrew? How many Americans who are interested in Israel in general can read Hebrew and can read the sources? So you have to rely upon interpreters. You have to rely upon professors. You have to rely upon someone who says they read the language, but what they might just be doing in front of this podium, they may be preaching their politics and not teaching to you the sources. Academic podia, is that the plural? Academic podiums, I won't offend my Latin teacher from high school. Academic podiums became places for preaching, not for teaching. I'll get to that in a moment. And when you have a particular point of view about Israel, and you're of a certain political ilk, or you have a certain political leaning, you will teach your course on any topic related to a social science and humanities, and you will use this podium as a means to publicize your point of view, not necessarily the history and the politics of how something unfolded. When was the last time a dean walked up to a professor and said, "You can't include that in your syllabi"? It's irrelevant. It's polemical. I don't know many deans who will intrude into their departments or into individual faculty and say, "That is not objective." Why? Because it's academic freedom. That's what goes on in universities. If I want to choose what's on my syllabus, you can't tell me not to. And if I tell you to read Edward Said and Tony Judt, two individuals who actually delegitimized Israel in the 80s and 90s and the early 2000s, And if they are major articles that are on the syllabus, I can tell you right away that that professor is going down a particular political path. And no dean and no department chair is going to go knock on the door and say, Professor Smith, that's not kosher. So if you're asking why Israel on campus may not be treated at least fairly down the line, it's because individual professors have the prerogative to choose, and they have the right to choose the materials, and the materials they choose may only be in a language that they understand, or they may only have access to a particular article because it appears in a particular journal, which if they want it, they can get it through their university library. But you, the common person, can't get it unless you pay $35 or $45 for it. You want to download it? Pay $35. If Ed and I want it, we go to JSTOR, we dial in our university library, we download it, we use it. Access to source material for the common man is not available. Or it's in a foreign language. One of the reasons for establishing the Center for Israel Education in 2008 was to put sources online for people to read themselves that's completely untainted by Ken Stein's point of view. If kids want to learn, give them a chance to learn. Don't stand there and teach them how to advocate. Advocacy is terribly important. I got it. It's important in politics. I got it. I understand it. I understand there are organizations that are created in order to do nothing but advocacy, because that's what you do in the political system, but you don't do it in the classroom. I wouldn't. I don't. I haven't. And when I taught the Arab-Israeli conflict at the university, at Emory University, I can tell you I averaged between 90 and 140 kids every single time I offered the class. And I told the kids the very first day of class what the midterm was. Discuss the Arab-Israeli conflict from its origins to 1948. And then I also told them the first day of class what the final was. Discuss the Arab-Israeli conflict from 1948 to the present with a 3-page introduction and how did you get to 48. You think you can BS that, those two questions? I don't think so. Either you know the readings, either you've done the readings, either you listen to the lectures, or you haven't. Now, I did that for 25 years. And I demanded the students know the sources. I asked my peers across North America, who may see this on Zoom, are they really asking their students to read the sources? Or they're really telling the students to read what the professor thinks they should read in order to reflect the professor's point of view? That's what's going on campus. I can only speak for some campuses that teach modern Israel today, or teach Israel in the conflict. Am I vexed by it? You bet your sweet portions of your anatomy I am. I was fortunate at Michigan. I had great professors, and I didn't know it. You know, you go through, you're in the tunnel and you're going through it, you don't have any context for what's happening to you at that particular moment. You know, you're at one end of the Holland Tunnel or one end of the Lincoln Tunnel, and then you get to the other end, and you never take a look at what it looks like inside the tunnel because you just assume all tunnels are alike. The faculty at Michigan in the late 60s and the early 70s were remarkable. Remarkable. I had a professor who went to Princeton. He studied the Muslim Brotherhood. We as graduate students had to read his dissertation as it was transformed into a book called The Society of Muslim Brotherhood. And he made us understand medieval Islam in the contemporary sense. I had a professor who became later a professor at Princeton and also head of the American University in Beirut. He taught us what political science in the Middle East was all about, and he ventured into the concept of political culture. And he taught us the difference between Egypt and Syria and Morocco and Jordan. And if those differences had been known to Brzezinski and Carter, they wouldn't have assumed that Sadat could represent all Arabs when he decided to go to Camp David in 1978. And Brzezinski recognizes it. He said, I didn't understand the Arab world. And Carter recognized it well before he left the White House. So if our academics don't study it and they don't understand it, and they tiptoe away because you can't study political culture because it's sensitive, you may get into trouble if you point out that apolitical culture has a certain tendency in making decisions as to compared to someone else. As if there's uniformity all over the Middle East, all over the Arab world. No one can tell me there's uniformity in the political culture of the countries of Central and South America. You can't do that, because it's not true. Costa Rica is not Argentina. We've gotten in the habit of lumping things together and teaching them as black and whites. And the study of modern Israel has become a casualty of it. Amongst Jews in North America, there are three topics that constantly are on people's minds. I don't mean just Jews, I mean people who look at Jewish history. One is anti-Semitism. Two is what happened to Jews between 39 and 45. And the third, quote unquote, is the injustice to the Palestinians. I have many very good friends who are my contemporary colleagues, who teach at the Hebrew University, teach at Tel Aviv, including a person who made an enormous name for himself and of great success here as a scholar. He wishes he would have made better progress as a golfer, Asher Susser. These are individuals that I looked up to my entire life because their scholarship is impeccable. Their scholarship rises above polemics. And yet, they, as Israeli academics, have just been told by the Middle East Studies Association of North America that we agree with the BDS movement and we may make life difficult for you as academics who want to come to this country or want to study further Middle East and the United States. Now, the resolution is a lot more complex than I just stated because I didn't read the resolution entirely. But associations, academic associations, have now gotten into the business of taking a stand on the politics of the moment. How many academics sign letters? I was appalled by blank, 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 blank. I'm one of 250 people, blank, 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 because of what Israel did this and Israel did that, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. When I was at Michigan in the 70s, my teachers didn't sign letters of protest. Maybe they did in the Vietnam War, against the war. Maybe I got to take that back. I got to take that back. Some of them actually did. But it wasn't like measles against one state. And you have kids on campus who have faculty members who sign these letters, and then you expect those professors to walk into a classroom and be reasonably objective. I have juniors, rising seniors, I have their parents coming to me and saying to me, can I send my kids to Emory? Is it, quote, safe? Are they going to be badgered in the classroom because they're Jewish and they may identify with Israel? I can't speak for other faculty members, though I would like to, but I can't do it here because they're still teaching at Emory. It's a disease that isn't going to go away. And Middle Eastern Study Centers decided in the 60s they would train people in these foreign language areas. So we had wonderful people coming from Iran, who were in the Peace Corps in Iran, or in the Peace Corps in Morocco. They came and became my academic peers at the University of Michigan. Brilliant kids, smart students, went on to do wonderful things in the academic and the business world. But the Middle East Center at the University of Michigan didn't give scholarships in Hebrew. If you got a scholarship in Hebrew, it was because the Near Eastern Studies Department had you do it, or gave it to you. No. It deserves no applause. It deserves a statement to universities throughout the country. Why didn't that happen sooner? The first institute for the study of modern Israel in the United States I created in 1998. It was one that was established just immediately after I did it at American University. And then they did one in Toronto. I had a great professor of Zionist history at the University of Michigan, a young assistant professor by the name of Yehuda Reinhartz, who later on becomes president of Brandeis. I didn't know how good Reinhartz was until I sat in his class, until about 8 or 10 years ago I pulled out his notes. And I decided to appropriate some of those notes for the class I was now preparing on modern Zionism. Because Reinhardt's compilation of the sources that he read was still relevant. Post-67 war, by the way, any of you taking notes on this, if you want the PowerPoint, I'll give it to you. There was a myth that developed after the Six-Day War that if Israel returned the territories and the two-state solution was the result, then everything would be fine with Israel and it could go about its business as if the lion was laying right down with the lamb and everything was just fine. Would be just like Canada's relationship is with the United States. Israel's problem, however, it searched and it found at times sincere Palestinians interested in resolving the conflict. But they also found that there were elements within the Palestinian community that were not fully committed to ending the conflict totally. And it became sort of a policy of Israeli leaders to test Palestinian intentions. Why can't you repeat what happened in the 70s between Sadat and Begin? Why is it not possible today? Can't they just stop fighting? Well, you have topography and geography that matter. You have the fact that Palestinian side still wants to resolve the conflict by allowing Palestinian refugees into pre-67 Israel, which would change the demography of the state of Israel. And today, unlike any other time in the history of the Palestinian national movement, and I can say this with a high degree of certitude because I've studied it in the 30s and 40s, the Palestinian Arab national movement today is more divided, more dysfunctional than it's ever been. And its institutions are the weaker they've ever been. Anyone who reads Arabic sources knows that. And if you listen to the webinars that were put out by Palestinians themselves after the Abraham Accords were issued in September of 2020, you hear Palestinian scholars ripping their clothes verbally about how their institutions are not representing themselves and representing Palestinian interests. Sadat and Begin could recognize each other because there wasn't a question of the stability of the other side. And there wasn't a question about the sovereignty or legitimacy of the other side. And that has not yet been worked out between Palestinians and Israelis. And there are many Israelis who just don't want to recognize the Palestinians as a national movement. I get it. I understand that. But you can't force an agreement on people unless they want it. And you can stand it here in the classroom and say a two-state solution is essential. That's all Israel needs to do. But does anyone ever say, so who's going to come up with the $2.5 or $3 billion a year to fund the Palestinian economy? Who's coming forth? Who's going to come forth after 4 million people are now made homeless because of Putin's autocracy? Who's going to come forth that's going to solve the Syrian refugee problem? One of the reasons that you have Arab states recognizing and coming forth with Israel is because they don't want to wait for the Palestinian issue anymore. They want to resolve their own inherent problems pragmatically, because national interest now is more important than ideological commitment. Doesn't mean they're giving up on the two-state solution, and it doesn't mean they're giving up on the Palestinians. It means we have to look out for ourselves first. Now, the internet has been a contributor to how young minds learn, or how they acquire information. I'll step back and I won't say learn. You'll forgive me for correcting myself. And then there's a hijacking of Israeli history. You know, I worked for Jimmy Carter for 12 or 13 intense years after he left the White House. By the way, I went to the Carter Center to find my name. My name is no longer there as part of the Carter Center history. That's all right. Carter published a book in 2006 called Palestine, Peace, Not Apartheid. And I took issue with it, not so much because of the title, but because there was evidence in the book that he had skewed the contents of meetings where I was a note-taker. And he started quoting from UN resolutions that were wrong, and he just disregarded sources. I am an idol worshiper from my discipline history. I'm an idol worshiper. I will not be moved from my cement. You can't tell me the sun rises in the west when we know it rises in the east. And Carter said UN Resolution 242 requires Israel to withdraw from all the territories, as Menachem Begin agreed to at Camp David. What a piece of nonsense that was. And I said, I can't abide by this. No matter how much respect I have for the 39th president and for what he did at Camp David. So I have tried hard as one individual, and this isn't, a fundraising mission here tonight. I have tried as one individual to try and make the contents available to the general public. The sources great analysis when people write on a day-to-day basis and from think tanks, and they write good pieces of analysis. I try and make it available so people will read it, because I have access to it that they don't have the time of day to even think about. This is a summary of what I said earlier. I'm not going to go over it. Again, if you want a copy of the PowerPoint, just email me at kenstein@israeled.org, and I would be more than happy to share it with you. Question you have to ask yourself, are trips to Israel equivalent to learning? I think they're good. I think they're important. I think they're valid. I don't think they take the place of learning in the classroom. I think they can augment. I think spending time in a place, if you're going to study Spanish, go spend 6 months in Madrid. Learn the language, learn the culture, get deeply into it. I don't think 10 days or 2 weeks or 3 weeks is going to make a difference. It may rejuvenate your identity, and in this case, rejuvenate would be spelled R-E-J-E-W. It may rejuvenate your identity. It may actually help parents who feel that their kids need an additional injection. I think the experience in Israel can be terrific, but unless you do something to follow up in learning, it was a trip. And I don't think high school learning about Israel and the Middle East or about the Middle East, I've just been approached by one of the schools in the Atlanta metropolitan area to help their teachers learn a little bit more about the Middle East in context and in content than just what they've been mandated to do by the state. Because they've had some parents who've complained to what the kids are coming home from public school teachers. I'm not talking about colleges and universities. So, what is the problem and what's the RX? I'm sorry, Ed, I've gone over time. This is Professor Reinhardt's in 2003 when he gave a talk at the Jewish Federation in New York. He gave 3 key reasons for lack of understanding about Israel and what needed to be done. He said there was a lack of knowledge, there was an inability to effectively disseminate information, and there were a lack of trained specialists who know Israel and also know the Middle East. Alan Hoffman, who was head of the Jewish Education Department of the Jewish Agency, as we look at the ways in which Israel is presented and taught in North American Jewish education and the ways in which Zionism is interpreted mainly as the support for Israel, it becomes clear that our current conceptions about presenting and teaching Israel within Jewish educational frameworks, both formal and informal, are unable to anchor Israel as a core. Steve Bain, American Jewish Committee, 2007 also. There clearly is a massive and widespread ignorance regarding the history, politics, culture, of course, language of the Jewish state. This is especially true on secondary school and college levels and reflects itself in the widely reported isolation of Jewish students on campus. We need to do a much better job of acquainting young people with the basics of Israeli history and politics. Number 5, a chair in Israel Studies, great idea. Just be sure you know what and who you're getting. Be sure that the candidates have been vetted fully. And just because there's a chair in Israel Studies doesn't mean that that person in 25 or 30 years is going to have in his and her mind what the donor's intent was when the dollars were initially given. And that's not just the University of Arizona, That's for all institutions. Because there have been plenty of appointments in the United States where chairs in Israel studies have become lifetime appointments, and the people who are in those chairs are not what you would call individuals you would want your kid in high school, in college, learning about Israel. Because this is a preaching platform, not a teaching venue. Here we are. The less and less number of people who understand the reason for Israel, and I'm not just talking about running in favor of having a place for security, though you can certainly say that Jews who are fleeing the Ukraine today are certainly happy that there's a state called Israel. It's not March of 1939. The Hebrew, Lihiot Am Chofshi Ba'artzenu, to be a free people in our land. That's part of the current Israel national anthem. So we know what Jewish literacy is. This is Joe Telushkin's, these are all the things that Joe Telushkin thinks are important in terms of Jewish literacy. I couldn't find anything on the website anywhere to define Israel literacy. Couldn't find it. Had a great conversation with David in the car on the way over. I said, David, I can find the concepts and the content for the 19th and 20th century. Can you help me, David, with getting me from the period of before the destruction of the Second Temple with writings and concepts? He said, sure. I acknowledge what I don't know. My limitations are limitless. I realize that. So you go to people who know. I'm not going to go through this in great detail because there's just too much information here. But again, I'd be glad to provide it to you. This is just a period up to 48 on what should be part of Israel literacy. And it needs to be explained, it needs to be amplified, but it needs to be done. If you don't know what to teach, and you're doing it simply because you have a sense of what should be learned, then you're relying upon your own intuition and not necessarily the knowledge base of many, many other people who have come before you. That's the story of self-determination. That's November 20th, 77. That's the overarching concept. And the last slide would not have happened, and you'll see in a moment, if there wasn't a notion of Jewish self-determination. Don't everybody laugh at once. That's Kiddush at Camp David in September of 78 with the President of the United States. That was not possible in March of 1939. Thank you for your time.
Our speaker has another event in not too many minutes. But let's do 3 questions. Yeah.
Absolutely, and I will repeat the question for the people on Zoom. But speak up so I can hear. Yes, please.
What is an objective source of history?
What is
an objective source of history?
an objective source of teaching? Of history. It would be audacious for me to stand here and say, I have an answer. I think objectivity is sought by everybody who teaches history. I think the key is to find a variety of sources and blend them into one and have sentences that have however's in them, or have nevertheless, or this was the predominant trait, or but this was a variation from it. I will say without equivocation that most of the histories that are taught about modern Israel in the period from the 1880s until 1948 do not deal with the socioeconomic background of what Palestine was like in the 1880s and the transformation that occurred in Palestine from the 1880s until 48. People don't talk about this absolutely impoverished condition of the Palestinian Arab community due to the destruction of World War I. No one talks about it. The assumption is that these two communities were economically equal at that moment. They weren't. That's one of the reasons why the Zionists succeed. Because the opposition was more interested in feeding its family. Assuming there was a unified opposition. Now that's part of the objectivity. It doesn't mean that you're standing here saying the Zionists have every right to claim success and say we did it. They can claim it. But unless you tell that whole story, then you're not being objective. How can we tell American history without telling the history of slavery? Really? You gonna leave it out? Yes, please, sir.
Any comment on anti-Semitism on campus versus no?
Can I comment on anti-Semitism on the campus? Yeah, we can be here until Shacharit tomorrow morning if you want. Shacharit is the Jewish morning prayer.
My grandson is looking for a college that's very good for Jews.
I think you need to look at faculty on campus. You need to take a look at the strength of organizations on campus that support students who are Jewish. And this is not necessarily having to do with Israel per se. I think you need to take a look at the reputation of the institution. I think you need to take a look at the age of the faculty who are going to be teaching in the area of study that that particular person may be interested in studying. I would say the younger the faculty in general, the more likely they may be, you see how I covered myself? More likely they may be to use this for politics rather than for teaching. It's not a generalization I can apply to every institution or to every single faculty member. But not only do you get accepted at an institution, the student has got to do the due diligence at looking at the syllabus of every single course. And don't sit there and just rate the professor. Do the due diligence. You spend time getting into an institution, you're going to spend $25,000 to $60,000 a year in going to the institution. That student darn well better choose good professors. Don't choose titles of courses. An institution may have chosen the student. The student now has the obligation for 4 years to choose the faculty from whom he or she will receive an excellent education. And every time you make a mistake, that's a $5,000 to $7,000 mistake. Think about it in dollars and cents. Last, let me just say one more thing to the Plevan family. What you have done at this institution and what you may continue to do is singularly important. The fact that you have people like Ed Wright, the fact you have a dean who understands, an institutional memory that cares, that matters when donors approach institutions. You have a great mix here. And an honor to you, to your son, and to the memory of both your son and your wife. Thank you for having me today.